I suck at making notes. I would just read over a textbook in order, rewrite everything by hand, and I just have a massive wall of words staring at me. And the only thing that happens was my hand hurt. It would take me ages to write these notes, but it would take me even longer to review them because I had to read through the whole thing again and again, thinking that I was learning something when in fact I wasn't. And it was only marginally increasing my knowledge each time I reviewed it, so it was vastly inefficient. I'd always lose these notes and I didn't even want to read them because they were so ugly and I couldn't even read my handwriting half the time anyway. Surely there's a way to make notes so that the first time you write them, you already remember a large chunk of what you wrote and you don't have to constantly reread them. Well, actually, yes, there is. 96% of students are said to make notes, so it's something that you must know how to do well. But a lot of people, like me, and maybe you, don't know how to make notes properly. So here's how to make notes that you will remember, and how to use them to ace that test. Number 1. Make them memorable. When making notes, make them funny, easily rememberable, and explicit. You can do this by explaining things in your own words in terms that you will understand. Because, for example, anyone can write down in their notes, Lyndon B. Johnson was assassinated by Alvaro in 1296. But that's just so boring, right? So instead of copying this down, you can just write LBJ took the L in 1296. And this is funny and memorable. You form a visual image in your mind of LBJ taking the L, or just in any other way you find funny and memorable. And as we talk about later, your notes are actually only an extension of your thinking. And so by making notes and in that moment, describing Lyndon B. Johnson getting assassinated as taking the L, when you come to review that, you're going to instantly remember that in the test of him, that visual image you had in your mind. Because as we already talked about in how to memorize anything, your brain remembers best when they're funny and visual. You can mix in symbols, emojis, abbreviations, and slang you understand, because your notes are going to be what you look at. Here are 2 pages of notes. Which of these 2 notes was more easy to understand? This one, right? Obviously. Because it's visual and your brain processes images 7 times faster than words. And to my bilingual chingus out there, you can even make notes in 2 languages. This might sound crazy, but for example, some concepts and just words to you make sense in one language more than another. And so in English, whereas you have to write 4 or 5 words out for a single concept, sometimes it's just one word, or it's just more memorable. For example, whether it's writing America as Miguk or using a word that's just more memorable for you. The point of all this is that we're condensing the info in a way that's more understandable and manageable for us in our own way, whether that's through symbols, drawings, flowcharts, visualizations, or in a different language. We're taking the info that our teacher's giving us, that textbook's giving us, and it's going through a different set of filter. It's going from our brain before onto the paper. Whereas for a lot of the time, and what I used to do for a long time, is that as soon as the teacher says something, I'll instantly jot it down without even processing it through my brain even once. You need to be associating, chunking, and visualizing all of this in your brain before it goes onto your paper. Because you know too well, you take notes after a lecture, but then you have to reread your entire notes after the lecture because you didn't actually take in the notes or concepts in the lecture. Rather, you just copy down the words word for word. You should never just copy down words, and make sure to utilize visualization and chunking in some way and linking it to images and symbols. And the second thing is to understand the difference between linear and non-linear notes. Linear is in a sequential form of order. It's chronological. It's what most of your textbooks are written as. The header, chapter 1, plant reproduction, chapter 2, human reproduction, chapter 3, inheritance. Whereas non-linear is more freeform and it allows ideas to interconnect and you see how everything links together. That's why for most notes you should be doing it by hand or drawing it, because inherently by typing you can only do it in that chronological linear type of form of notes. And I like taking notes on the iPad with my stylus because you can interconnect ideas and see how they all link together instead of just having a block of information on the page. By seeing how everything links together, it actually strengthens how long you'll remember it for. Because if you think about it, if one thing's interconnected to the whole thing, you're going to remember it because it's connected to more than one different type of pathway. If you remember, for example, plant reproduction and you link it to gametes, but you also link that to reproduction DNA, you're going to have 2 separate pieces of strands that you're already linking it to, so it doubles the strength of your neural connections. And that's why the box method for note taking is just as efficient, even if you don't have an iPad, just by making notes in separate boxes based on their concepts and then linking it together at the end can make it so you see the bigger picture and you just understand and memorize notes for longer. This is a visual form and it's easy to review because instead of having to read through that entire chunk of notes that we wrote ineffectively before, you can just go to specific boxes that you're struggling on and just review those instead. Third thing is cognitive load. You need to think of notes as an extension to your thinking, not a replacement. When you're in a lecture hall and the person is talking, your brain starts to get new knowledge, new concepts, etc. and it's all adding to that cognitive load. And your And your brain's job is to process all that information, think of questions, and just think about that topic, right? And when that gets too much, you should be writing notes on a piece of paper, offloading that information, so that when you come back later, it's meant to be like a respawn point anchor type of thing, to think back to that lecture hall and what concept you're learning then, to recall that moment, right? And this can't happen if you just write down or copy everything that the person is saying immediately, because your brain hasn't had the time to make the connection and doesn't have a point to think back to or recall. You want the cognitive load to actually be heavy enough for you to learn, because that's how you learn. When you're learning something hard and you have questions and things you don't understand, the learning comes from trying to figure out the answer from that question, from your brain asking those type of things. Like at the gym, you only make progress when it's nearly too much for you and you work towards failure. You have to struggle with learning. Don't offload everything immediately. You're scared of missing out on the information and you're bypassing your brain and just writing it down on a piece of paper, but in fact you're not learning anything then, and then you have to learn it after the lecture, which is just inefficient because you're spending double the time. Learn it there and don't have to read it again afterwards. And a bonus tip is to make these notes with the thought and awareness that you're going to revisit these notes at some time. So while making notes, think of different questions that examiners might ask. I like writing my notes and having a question, or I'm writing them in Notion, I use the toggle feature and write the answer below, like for example in my Latin notes, so that when I come to review it, I can immediately actively recall that, and it's already a form of revision. But to summarize, remember that notes are just for you, so make them memorable and visual in your own way, and know the difference between linear and non-linear notes, and understand that cognitive load is needed to make progress, as well as writing down questions. And if you want this Notion template with all my notes, all these different databases and tables that I use to boost my cognitive learning, remembering, and others, you can check out the link in the description. But as always, I'll see you next time.